My name's Graham Bell, and in this presentation I want to introduce you to the European Union's newish Deforestation Regulations, or EUDR, the regulations themselves, whom they apply to, and some of the requirements that they place upon publishers and others in the book supply chain. And I also want to cover one of the ways that you might be able to make these requirements a little easier to work with. So we're looking at the European Union's regulation on deforestation-free products, which applies to physical products. What do these regulations hope to accomplish? Well, they aim to limit deforestation, forest degradation, and loss of biodiversity anywhere in the world. They do this by mandating deforestation-free products, products that don't rely on raw materials that come from areas that have been recently deforested. And by recently here, it means the end of 2020. If an area was deforested in the last century, or even as recently as 2020 itself, raw materials from that area are not covered by these regulations. But if the trees were cut down after the beginning of 2021, then the timber and all derived products like paper or fiberboard are covered by the regulations. This comes out of the EU's drive towards sustainability and transparency within the supply chain. EU consumers are big consumers of commodities like wood, cocoa, coffee, soybeans, palm oil, rubber, and, not least, cattle. And these raw materials are often grown, or the cattle raised, in areas that have been very recently deforested. So the area of deforested and degraded land keeps increasing in order to fulfill the demand for the raw materials. And note that these regulations don't just apply to timber, but to all those other commodities as well, though obviously they're less directly relevant to our industry. So the EU is saying there's nothing wrong with these raw materials, so long as they come from land that has not been recently deforested, but we must not continue to make the problem worse. Thus, the regulations aim to limit Europeans' future contribution to deforestation and loss of biodiversity. This is a new regulation that passed into law in mid-2023, and this gave affected organisations 18 months to prepare for implementation. If you're not already preparing, you need to begin preparations now, as the key deadline is the end of December 2024. The new rules put a lot of emphasis on record keeping and traceability. If you're selling paper-based products, you need to know and be able to show where did the tree come from, and were those trees grown on recently deforested land. Now, I say these regulations are new, but in fact, before the middle of 2023, there were earlier regulations called the EU Timber Regulations, or EUDR, that had been in place for a decade or more before that. So EUDR is nothing particularly new. It's just been extended to cover a wider range of raw materials and more than just the initial production of timber. So what are the regulations and what do they require of anybody in the supply chain? As I said, each product's raw materials must be traceable and must be deforestation free. Now, under the regulations, you could be an operator in the supply chain, or you could be a trader. And I'll come back to what those mean in a moment. Anybody, operator or trader, who puts any product on the market in the European Union that is based on raw materials from the list I mentioned, not just timber, but coffee, palm oil, beef from cattle, and so on, needs to put appropriate checks in place to ensure that those raw materials came from land that was not recently deforested or degraded. So operators, and to some extent traders, have to collect and retain data about the provenance of the raw materials. So a book can be traced back to a specific plot of land that provided the raw materials, the tree, the pulp, the paper. This book, this paper, this card, this fiberboard was made from timber harvested from this forest. Operators need to keep and manage these records. Now, not all forests are equal. For some plots of land, they're in relatively low-risk countries where the timber trade is well managed and sustainable. And other trees come from forests that are in high-risk countries, countries where illegal logging may be prevalent, or where the forests are not managed, not replanted as they're harvested. So operators in particular don't just have to be able to trace the tree back to the land. They also have to do a risk assessment. How likely is it that these records have been falsified? Did the paper in fact really contribute to deforestation? And potentially, operators might also be required to take steps to mitigate those risks. It's about traceability of raw materials, but it needs to be backed up by compliance checks by national authorities, potential exclusion from the market for those who don't complete the due diligence properly, and even fines of up to 4% of an organisation's EU-based turnover. And as I said, it doesn't just apply to wood and paper. It applies to a wide range of raw materials. And that list of raw material commodities may lengthen in the future to encompass, for example, maize. And how does the compliance regime actually work? Well, the EU has created an online data portal. They call it the Deforestation Registry. And those operators are required to upload information about the provenance of raw materials used in their products. So if you, as an operator, are handling a particular book, you need to know what kind of paper and cardstock it uses. You need to be able to trace that paper and cardstock back to the paper mill and to the pulp and to the tree or the forest. And within that portal, each operator needs to create what's called a due diligence statement, or DDS, providing all the information about the raw materials for each product. Now, it's important to realise that in the real world, books are made from several different types of paper. In addition to the paper used for the majority of the pages, there may be a plate section on higher quality coated paper. And there's paper, card and fiberboard that goes into the cover and the jacket. And for a product to be compliant under EUDR, all of those different types of paper and fiberboard must individually comply with the regulations. So of course this raises a number of questions. The first is obviously, well, surely this doesn't apply to me. Now that's a perfectly good question, particularly if you're outside the EU. But despite that, it may well apply to you, unless you're, well, first of all, based outside the European Economic Area. That's actually slightly bigger than the European Union. It's 30 countries instead of 27. So based outside the European Economic Area, the EEA, and your books and the paper they're made from are manufactured outside Europe, and the raw materials for them come from outside Europe, and the books cannot be for sale at all inside the European Economic Area. Unless all three of these criteria apply, the EUDR applies to your books. So let's say you're a sizable American or Canadian publisher manufacturing books in North America with paper manufactured and trees grown in North America, but you're exporting those books to the EU, then EUDR applies. Or maybe you're a publisher in Europe, but you're exporting all of your books to somewhere outside of Europe. Despite that, EUDR applies. And that means that if just one of the paper types you're using is non-compliant, then your product as a whole is non-compliant with the regulations. And EUDR applies to books put on the market from the 30th of December 2024. But there's a little leeway if you're a small or medium-sized organisation. You may have another 6 months until the end of June of 2025 before you need to start your due diligence checks and report your products to the EU registry. To qualify, the regulations specify you must meet two of these three criteria. First, you must have less than €4 million on the balance sheet. That's about 4.5 million US dollars. Second, you must have less than €8 million net turnover. That's about 9 million US dollars. And third, you must employ fewer than 50 staff on average. Remember, you need to be in line with at least two of those criteria in order to qualify for a slight delay in implementation. And even then, whilst EUDR might not apply directly to you until mid-2025, the requirements will also apply to your supply chain partners, and you will still have to supply relevant data to them in good time if their deadline is earlier. It's their start date that will be important to you, not necessarily your own. The next obvious question is, well, do I have to do the due diligence? Do I have to upload all of the data about my products to the EU's registry? And the answer to that is, well, somebody has to do it. Whether that's you may depend on whether you're an operator or a trader. Operators have to complete in-depth checks before they can complete the due diligence statement. Traders don't have to create due diligence statements, but they do still have to complete a certain level of diligent checking, and they have to be able to refer back to due diligence statements, DDSs, prepared by other operators. And legally, the responsibility for making sure the product is in compliance with the regulations applies to everybody in the supply chain. Okay, so if I have to provide all of this data, obviously I do this only once. Well, not really. The regulations, in fact, apply at product level. Each ISBN is separate and will need a due diligence statement of its own. Now, granted, there are a few little get-outs. If your products use only 100% recycled paper and fiberboard, then those products are excluded from the regulations. But if it's only partly recycled, you still have to account for the non-recycled raw materials that you use. And the last big question that everybody wants to ask is, am I an operator or am I a trader? Because there are many more responsibilities placed upon operators. Answering that question, though, is a bit tricky. I should emphasize at this point, I'm not a lawyer. An editor cannot provide you with legal advice. But in most cases, publishers or their appointed representatives who are responsible for importation into the EU will be operators, and they'll be responsible for creating those due diligence statements. In many cases, paper mills and printers will also be operators. In a few cases, even large multinational retailers may also be operators. Small retailers will in almost all cases just be traders. The most meaningful advice I can give at this stage is talk to your lawyer. Everybody in the supply chain should consult a competent legal advisor to understand their responsibilities under the regulations. Now, some of these regulations have a metadata aspect. I've already said that due diligence statements are created by operators and that traders can refer back to previously created DDSs. So operators need to provide traders with some kind of DDS document reference that they can use when they need to refer back. And in some cases, organizations further down the supply chain are going to want not only these document references, but also the full provenance data for the raw materials. DDS references and provenance data needs to be passed along the supply chain. ONIX is EDItEUR's standard for metadata communication in the supply chain. It's not generally used by paper mills or printers, so unfortunately, these organizations will have to find the best method to communicate DDS references and provenance data to the publisher. But as soon as the data is known to the publisher, ONIX can be used to pass that data along to distributors, to wholesalers, and to retailers who need it. If you're already using ONIX for other aspects of your metadata, this is clearly the best option for you with the EUDR data as well. EDItEUR's been looking at the requirements for several months. We've already added new functionality to ONIX to enable this, and you can begin to use it right away. But I should warn you that if you're using a third-party system to create your ONIX, this may not be enabled in your system yet. System vendors who are EDItEUR members were given early access to these additions to ONIX to maximize the amount of time they had to prepare. And for everybody else, the extension to ONIX that I'm going to show you was released in July 2024. It's quite possible this hasn't been implemented in your system yet. Now, apologies if you're not so technical. I know some people are not familiar with the details of ONIX, and that's fine. But for those of you who are, this is how you can communicate those DDS document references. That document reference is carried in the tag called product form feature. This uses a product form feature type code 50. And code 50 means that product form feature value is one of those DDS document references. They look like this. The 24 is likely to be a year, the FR probably a country, and the remaining alphanumeric characters identify the due diligence statement itself. But we can't really guarantee the nature of that number because it's created within the online registry itself, and the details may change in the future. I think almost everybody in the physical supply chain, either from within Europe or from elsewhere, but supplying books to Europe, will have to do this. Will have to deliver a DDS reference of some kind to their supply chain partners. And this is the best picture I can find right now of that due diligence registry that the EU set up. It's still being tweaked, and there are a few people testing it. As an operator, you complete your diligent checks with your upstream suppliers, the paper mills, the printers, and so on, and you complete any risk assessment and mitigation required. Then you put all the details about that and the raw materials themselves into the portal. And the portal then gives you a DDS document reference that you then pass on in your ONIX to other organizations. Going a little further than that, some people in the supply chain, downstream operators, will need to know the details of where the trees grew. And that's communicated in this way. There's a product form feature type code 48. Specifically, that refers to the provenance of the raw materials used for the cover. And as you'll see on the next slide, it could be 47 for the body of the book, or it could be 49 for a slipcase or some retail packaging. And then, with those codes 47, 48, and 49, product form feature description at the bottom is a GPS coordinate. GPS coordinates are made up of two decimal numbers, a latitude and a longitude, in that order. Latitudes can vary from plus 90 to minus 90. And if it's a negative number, the location is south of the equator. Longitudes can vary from plus 180 to minus 180, with positive being east of the Greenwich meridian and negative being west. That means that if the trees grew in Canada, latitude will be positive and longitude will be negative. For Sweden, both would be positive. And if the trees grew in Brazil, latitude and longitude will both be negative. It's both south and west. You see here we have a single GPS location, one latitude, one longitude. Now you'd think that a single GPS location would be the location of a single tree, because a GPS coordinate with 6 decimal digits, that's what the EU requests, gives you a position correct to the nearest 10 centimeters or so, about 4 inches. And you can get these GPS coordinates from Google Maps or from a mobile phone. In fact, a single GPS coordinate is not really used as the location of a single tree. It gives you the middle of a small plot of land, up to 4 hectares in area. That's a square 200 metres by 200 metres, or about 10 acres. So if the plot of land where the trees grew is that small, then you can nominate a central point with one single GPS location. If you have a much larger forest, you use a different method, effectively drawing a polygon that represents the forest boundary. This is how you do it in ONIX. In this case, you'll see we're using code 47 that denotes the raw material for the body pages of the book. And we're using a list of GPS coordinates. There's actually 4 GPS coordinates here, separated by commas. These 4 locations are the points you use to draw the polygon around the forest boundary. In this case, we have red, green, and blue points which define a triangular forest, and then red again, because we want the polygon drawn around the forest to be closed. And what the ONIX is saying is that the trees were taken from within this forest polygon. And a good practice tip, draw your polygons clockwise and do make sure they're closed by repeating the first point again. So here we have single points for a very small forest of 4 hectares or less, and polygons for larger forests. There's an intermediate option as well with just 2 GPS locations, but that's not illustrated here. Polygons can be almost any size, although a polygon can't cross into more than one country, it can't cross a land ownership boundary, and nor can it cross the 180-degree meridian. Now, EDItEUR is looking at adding a little bit more flexibility to this. What you've already seen is what we already have in ONIX as of July 2024. There are 2 possible future additions that have been proposed. The first relates to something I haven't mentioned yet. Product form feature value must contain the country code for the country that the forest is in. This relates back to countries that are high risk or low risk, and the country code will drive the requirement for risk assessments and the enforcement regime. And there's a date when the trees were felled and harvested. The date of harvest is important because if your trees were cut down prior to the end of 2020, they're not subject to the regulations. And remember, this is what we already have, but we're looking at an option to add the Latin name of whatever species of tree it was. In this case, it's white spruce, Picea glauca, which is common across Canada and the northern United States. It's very often used in paper manufacture. In Europe, it might be Picea abies, which is equally commonly used in paper making. The species has to be the Latin name, the so-called binomial name of the tree. The other extension we're looking at is to compress many polygons into one. So we have here the list of 4 GPS locations, which, as I said, define a triangular forest. But this is paper made from white spruce that comes from 2 different forests. Right now, you need a second repeat of product form feature for the second forest. But the 2 polygons can be combined into a single list of locations, like this. Not just that one triangular forest with 4 GPS coordinates, but an additional square forest with an additional 5 points. Multiple forests are separated by semicolons in the list of GPS coordinates. Just as a reminder, what you see on this slide is not part of ONIX yet, but it's been proposed and is likely to become part of ONIX in October 2024. Now, returning from the world of metadata to the real world, each type of paper, each type of card or fiberboard used in the product is going to have a provenance. Most papers will in fact be made from pulp that comes from multiple forests and multiple species of tree. Most likely, they will need multiple repeats of product form feature in your ONIX. A typical hardcover book is going to need information about the main body paper, maybe different paper for a plate section or an insert, the boards of the cover, the different paper that you use for end papers, and for the paper of the jacket. In most cases, if you put faux linen on the cover, that covering will almost certainly be a paper product too. So expect a lot of repeats of product form feature. Now there's one minor element of uncertainty if your book happens to be leather bound. Some types of leather are a result of raising cattle. And cattle was one of those commodities I listed at the very beginning. And so leather bindings may also need a provenance, this time where those cattle were grazed. Of course, if you're using goat skin or sheepskin leather or eel skin, which doesn't actually come from eels, the regulations don't apply. Or if it's bonded leather, which is reformed from waste leather offcuts, and it probably counts as recycled, you most likely don't need to worry. But if you've got leather binding that comes from cattle, then potentially you need to provide a provenance for that too. Perhaps using the same method as for cover paper and board, but using a bovine species name like Bos taurus. And I know all of this sounds a bit complex. Sadly, it's about to get slightly more complex still. It's a feature of our industry that we manufacture multiple impressions of a particular book. And it's quite possible that each different impression uses different sources of paper. Same product, but different brand of paper, or maybe an identical brand, but the manufacturer has switched the sources of pulp used. Now we could treat each impression as a distinct and unique product, but I don't think that's how it's going to happen. Because we don't have an identifier that works right down to impression level. Of course, ISBN works at product level. And it's not how the EU portal really works. And even if you did treat each impression as a separate product with its own unique due diligence statement, it's still not going to work. Because when a bookseller or a consumer orders a book, they don't know, and you don't know, which impression they're going to get. They could get the latest third impression hot off the press into the warehouse and then straight back out again on its way to the customer. Or they could get a copy from the first or second impression that has lain at the back of the warehouse storage bay for a month or a year. Most warehouses that fulfill books don't apply lot control as part of their stock management. They don't store copies of each impression separately, nor do they implement any kind of first in, first out policy for order fulfillment. So which impression a customer gets is somewhat unpredictable. You could even receive a copy of the first impression that was sold to a retailer, sat in a bookshop, and was then returned to the warehouse and used to fulfill a new order. The types of paper and their provenances can't be correct if those paper types change between impressions. There's a potential solution. Instead of having a list of provenances specific to the third impression, which will often differ from the provenances for the first and second impression, build a cumulative list. If your first impression uses this paper, and your second impression uses that paper, and maybe for the third impression you've used a different cardstock for the binding, list them all. Yes, you're going to have to update the provenance in the DDS and in the ONIX, but instead of replacing provenances, you just add new provenances. You don't need to remove the old ones. So each additional impression with different paper will require a post-publication update. But that post-publication update to the metadata is relatively simple. And here's how it might look in ONIX. What we see is what applies to the first and second impression. And you can see we've used some paper that came from the triangular forest and some cardstock for the cover that came from the very small forest with a single GPS coordinate. For the third impression, we've actually dropped that paper and started to use a new paper with a different provenance. You add that to the set of provenances like this. So now we have provenances for 2 papers and for the cardstock. Whichever impression a retailer ultimately receives, the provenances will be in the data, even though some of them might not be contributing to the book at all. Building a cumulative list of provenances like this seems like the only practical way to go for our industry. And here's a few final considerations. First, do you use paper accredited by the Forest Stewardship Council? If the publisher can guarantee that paper comes from well-managed forests, FSC gives publishers a certification or badge for each product, and you often see an FSC logo printed on the book itself. The Forest Stewardship Council has been running this scheme for many years, but in mid-2024 they launched an additional protocol which brings their accreditation into line with the requirements of the European Union Deforestation Regulations. Think of it as a kind of FSC+. FSC has also created a handy new framework for risk assessments that can be used if you know your paper is coming from one of those high-risk countries. Second, print on demand, POD. It's a bit of a problem because the paper type used is not directly known to the publisher. It might not even be known to the printer until the customer order is received and that specific copy printed. So there'll have to be a way for POD manufacturers to collect these details and pass them on to retailers with the fulfilled products. It seems that POD manufacturers will almost certainly count as operators. They'll have to complete a DDS for each combination of provenances used, and they'll have to pass these details back to publishers and forward down the supply chain to retailers. We've not fully worked out how this will work yet. So when does the registry become available? Well, it looks like mid-December of 2024, which to me seems like it's cutting it fine for a December 30th deadline. The EU is creating user instructions, and those should be available about now. There's some training for October 2024, user registration in November, and the go-live date for the registry is in mid-December. The last couple of slides here give you some links through which to seek further information, and then I'll also answer some frequently asked questions at the end. Under the EU heading here, there are links to the text of the EUDR regulations, to information about how the registry works, and so on. Under CPI, that organisation, as a printer, has produced one of the better guides I've seen to EUDR, and that's a good document to download. And lastly on this slide, there's a reference to that FSC or FSC Plus accreditation with its new legal module. On this slide, there are links to some of EDItEUR's own documentation, which is all freely downloadable, of course. The main ONIX specification and best practice guides, the controlled vocabularies or code lists, and a couple of mailing lists you can join. The ONIX mailing list is quite technical, but it's a good place to ask those technical questions. The News from EDItEUR list is a much more general distribution of news about EDItEUR activities. And for those of you who have stuck with us throughout all of this, but remain completely baffled about the many references to ONIX, if you're completely unfamiliar with ONIX, but you want to find out a little bit more in a mostly non-technical way, there's a URL that points to a short pre-recorded briefing video. It's just 15 minutes. That will give you more insight into just what ONIX is and how it's used. EDItEUR gets asked a lot of questions about EUDR, so we'll look at some of the more frequently asked questions. The single most common question is, will those regulations apply to reprints? Or do they only apply to new books published after the 30th of December? Opinions on this lean strongly towards the requirements applying to reprints, just as they do to new publications. The exact date of publication isn't particularly relevant. A reprint or new impression might not seem like a new product from the publishing point of view. It might not have a new ISBN, but at the very least, a reprint consists of new copies of the product. People ask us, well, I don't sell my books in the EU or the European Economic Area, but I do sell them in the United Kingdom. Do the regulations apply? Well, probably yes, though in a slightly roundabout way. Although the United Kingdom is now outside the EU and outside the EEA as well, there are special legal considerations for Northern Ireland, and the regulations do apply there. And given that there are very few internal barriers to movement of books within the UK, it's probably best to assume that books sold in the UK are effectively subject to the regulations. And people ask us whether there's some grand global master list of polygons with information about when those particular polygons were deforested or degraded. And the surprising answer is yes, there is a master map. It's called the EU Observatory, available at that URL, which will be used to inform risk assessments and enforcements. And lastly on this slide, can I provide this EUDR data if I'm still using ONIX 2.1? And the answer is unfortunately no. ONIX 2.1 is really considered obsolete these days. The ONIX I showed will work with ONIX 3.0 or 3.1. For anybody still relying on ONIX 2.1, we've been stressing the business risks of doing so for more than a decade now. For EUDR and some other requirements, those risks are now becoming apparent. It's important to understand the exact difference between an operator and a trader. Now, this is laid out in the regulations. Broadly, operators place a product on the European market. That could be a publisher, it could be a distributor, it could be an organisation that imports products into the EU, could even be a retailer. But whether or not you're an operator in your own right, you may still have to collect and store and manage the data in order to supply it to an operator who's acting on your behalf. In contrast, traders merely trade in that product within the EU, and they ultimately sell it to end users. There's a more limited level of due diligence required from traders. Can we offer more precise definitions? Well, the regulations give a set of definitions. The URL there leads you to the exact text of the regulations, and that text says, for example, an operator means any natural or legal person who, in the course of commercial activity, places relevant products on the market or exports them. All those definitions are available from within the directive. Article 2, there's a set of definitions. But they're often rather hard to parse, and this is why you must consult a lawyer. There's also extra information available from the EU's Green Business Hub, which makes it clear that large retailers who would otherwise merely be traders can have the same obligations as operators, including the need to file due diligence statements, and they share joint responsibility for non-compliance of products. And the last little question is about the use of soy-based inks. Since soybeans is the raw material for some printing inks, does the use of soy-based ink mean that your books need to comply to that aspect as well? Well, almost certainly not. Sales of soybeans or oil derived from them are in scope, but once that oil is chemically transformed into ink, the inks are out of scope. You can have a look at Annex 1 of the EU directive to see details of which soy products are covered. So given all this, where should I start? It's understandable that some publishers may feel a little overwhelmed, but first you should seek to understand your supply chain. Talk to your suppliers and begin to understand where the raw materials that they use come from. Building a map of your supply chain is going to be useful. Then, with that map, consult a lawyer on what your exact responsibilities under the regulations are, because these responsibilities depend on the details of that map. Remember, it's mostly about record keeping and transparency, traceability, and communication. Finally, for completeness, I should say that EUDR is not the only EU regulation you need to be concerned with. There's GPSR, the General Product Safety Regulations, which have an implementation guideline of the 29th of December 2024. For that, at minimum, publishers will need to provide a contact address of an entity within the EU responsible for product safety and liability issues, even if the product is a simple book and is considered very safe. That contact, a department or a person, will also be available in the ONIX. And then, in mid-2025, there's the European Accessibility Act, the EAA. Of course, everything we've talked about today is about physical products. The EAA applies to digital products and digital services.